Oh, hi, it's me. I thought I'd give you a little butt shake at the beginning because that's about as exciting as this video is going to get. So I've been watching this whole conversation unfold on YouTube recently about music and what that means for a goth identity, for goth culture, and how commitment to group ideology plays into the music. I wasn't necessarily going to comment on this. I think I've been on record pretty well about my opinions. But, this what kind of spurred this on is twofold. This morning before work, I spent a lot of time with my son. And this morning we spent about 2 hours playing music and dancing. And tonight, when I got home from work, I just received this shirt in the mail, and I wanted to DIY it, and so I had a few drinks and put on some music, and went through these steps to perform this ritual, this goth ritual, and it kind of got me thinking because both of these instances were incredibly meaningful, both emotionally and in a way that allowed me to feel connected to something bigger than myself, allowed me to feel like I was participating in a tradition of culture that had come before me and that existed now. And even though I was alone or with my son, I felt like I was a part of something. I felt like I was participating in a community of people that had a consistency of distinctive style, of distinctive identity, and this, substantive culture and norms and ideologies. And a large part of that was the music. So I thought I would kind of add some of my thoughts to this discussion and hopefully bring some flavor. I'm going to try and do what I do in regards to more academic minded analysis of the topic. The issue of whether or not goth music or music in general has any relevance to a goth identity is not a new discussion. If you've even simply on goth YouTube, if you've been on YouTube for the last 6 years or more, you know that this kind of stuff goes in cycles. And if you've been part of goth culture for I've been, probably about 16, 17 years or longer, you know that these types of discussions come up and go away. And it's this constant discursive nature of the culture, not discursive, dialectical nature of culture that propels it forward and kind of develops and evolves how we view ourselves and how we view our participation in goth culture. So that said, I don't think it's, even though some of the discussion is a rehash, even though some of these topics have been happening for the last 30 or more years, I still think they're worth having because culture moves on, new people come into the scene, and the dialectical nature of goth is what keeps it relevant, is what keeps it substantive, and what keeps it moving. So with that said, I want to take this in two directions. I want to talk about briefly my view on music in identity, and I want to talk about the underlying issue because I think while this discussion is important, there's certain presuppositions beneath the premises or the opinions being talked about online, whether you're pro music or anti music, not anti music, but don't think it's a vital element of a goth identity or of goth culture. There's a kind of a framework or an axiomatic perspective beneath that I think needs to be talked about, and will both give insight to our own views and also hopefully help us to think about what reasons brought us to that conclusion. I hear a lot of people saying, these are my thoughts, these are my opinions, these are my experiences, and then making claims without really truly kind of examining how they came to those beliefs, how they came to those opinions, and what method they used to determine that this was a reasonable opinion to have. So when it comes to music, I'll just say up front, I'm on the side of music is a element of goth that needs to be there both for the culture and for identity. So let me try to expand on that a bit. If you're looking historically at goth, there's no denying the propinquity of music to goth culture. Propinquity meaning closeness, close relationship. The music really kind of engendered or gave rise to goth culture. I don't think anyone would deny that. Even the people saying that it's not relevant to today, to goths today, I don't think they would deny it either. At least if they have any sort of done any sort of objective research on the issue. So that at the base, I think, is some reason to be fairly confident that music is important to goth. I think also what happens is something, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, from my own anecdotes. When I first started to be goth, and actually long after I was a baby bat, I was a big industrial fan. I had a working knowledge of goth music. I knew who the big 80s bands were and recognized that they were vital to the creation of goth, but I didn't actually like Bauhaus. I wasn't a fan of Christian Death. I didn't really like Virgin Prunes. I liked Sisters of Mercy, but that was about it. There was only a select few goth bands, and I think to that point, as we move further from the 80s, those sounds are going to become more and more anachronistic, more antiquated. They won't immediately resonate with youth, and that's okay. And I think part of what's happening is when you're looking for information on goth online, you get the big bands, Susie, Bauhaus, Christian Death, so on and so forth, and those are kind of foreign and obtuse sounds for youth to get into. So what happens with the conversation online, though, I think, is that these bands are rightfully hailed as deserving of respect, but there are no alternatives given. So what happened with me was, after a while of being in the culture, I ended up having a conversation with someone who was able to point me to newer goth bands, to goth sounds that were more along the lines of what I was into. At the time, I was really enjoying kind of neoclassical, ethereal, neo-folk, spookier kind of sounds, not so much in the rock arena. And what happened was, someone took the time to understand what my tastes were and to suggest goth bands that aligned with those. And I fell in love with those bands. And what happened was, over time, being exposed to more and more musicians and more sounds, I actually developed a taste. My preference for music changed, and I was able eventually to go back and actually really appreciate and enjoy those bands that I previously thought were unlistenable. And what happens online, I think, is that we don't give people that space to figure that out, and we don't give them the help to figure that out. So that's one of the things I think is missing, and that's where the kind of nuance is lost, because people feel like they have to like Bauhaus, or they only know about these certain few bands that are the goth bands, and they don't like them, so they feel they identify as goth, and they're going to say, well, you know what, you don't need to like goth music because they want to be goth, but they don't like the music. And I think the piece that's missing there is they have a myopic or a limited view of what goth music is. And to Angela Benedict's point, she made several playlists on her YouTube channel. And from my end, I've been doing a series called Post-Punk Party that I have 10 episodes of, and I've featured new goth bands, a different set of goth bands each episode from across the entire spectrum, to try and expose people to new bands and to new sounds that they may not have previously thought existed or had heard, and it might click. And once that clicks, I think if this is someone that's into goth culture, it's really going to kind of work their way in there. So where do we draw the line then? Do we as far as appreciation for goth music? So what I think is there needs to be a base either respect or appreciation for goth music with a caveat for ignorance for someone who just isn't exposed to bands they may enjoy. I think if someone is totally closed off to goth music, that's a problem. So first of all, what is goth music? I'll make a quick distinction here. I would say goth music is working within the tradition of music genres like goth rock, death rock, post-punk, and now cold wave and dark wave. And we have a separate category of gothic music, which is a much wider spectrum that could include bands like Evanescence or Marilyn Manson, or the term that's been thrown around, darkly inclined, that kind of thing. I wouldn't call that goth music, though. But I would say we can leave the door open to see where culture evolves to, because I think genres like cold wave, dark wave, ethereal music, like Dead Can Dance and that kind of thing, weren't traditionally thought of as goth music. And I think as the culture has evolved, those have been incorporated. Even some really odd kind of disparate post-punk bands have been included as well. So I'm leaving open, and this sort of fluidity will come up later, but I'm leaving the door open for the culture to move in that direction. But as of now, I make the distinction between goth and gothic music. So how do we determine where the threshold for fulfilling an appreciation of goth music is? I think if you're someone who doesn't particularly currently enjoy goth bands, but you acknowledge or have an understanding of their value in terms of subculture development, historically, the history of it, and the even current importance of goth bands as a catalyst for community and for sacred spaces for goths to gather, I think you can fulfill that requirement of the homology that creates goth identity. And this homology hypothesis, as I call it, is something I'm going to talk about later in the video. So we'll get to that. I will try to explain that. But to contrast it, well, not contrast it yet, but that, I think that's the base. And the hope there is, as they get involved in community, that person will be exposed to more and more sounds. And as they age and mature, Hopefully they will iterate on their taste and uh, come to an appreciation of goth music as a whole. The yeah, so in contrast to that, someone who blatantly refuses to care about goth music or denies any involvement of goth music in the formation, the sort of seminal formation of goth culture that we enjoy today, but that started in the early 80s, and also rejects suggestions for artists to check out or new sounds to try, and kind of holds firmly to a belief that goth music is irrelevant. I don't feel that person could fulfill that core tenet of what makes up a goth identity. That's not to say that can change, but I would not consider that person to be goth at the moment. So I want to talk about this goth homology or homology hypothesis to kind of explain, like I said, the underlying axioms, presuppositions that inform the end result, goth music, yes or no. I plan on making a blog post about this and actually writing an academic styled paper. I'll try to keep this less laden with jargon, or if I use jargon, I'll try to explain what these less common words mean. But what I want to get at is that whether or not goth is important to a goth identity is a secondary premise to the implicit or tacit axiom. And the two axioms that I see, axiom is something that is a underlying necessity, that's underlying kind of framework that is self-evident and necessary. I'm not necessarily married to the term axiom. You can use the word framework. That's the word I'm using at the moment. So the kind of two primary frameworks end up being split into post-subcultural, which I think is what's being used when people are claiming goth music is not necessary for someone to be goth, and the subcultural or new subcultural framework. So the postmodernist view is that youth culture is a buffet of style. These styles are constantly changing. They kind of smash into each other and shift. And participants create a identity that is transitive, tribes that are porous or kind of bleed together, and group membership that is not a dominating factor of the individual's life. And the participation is more of a playful way of getting kind of sensory intensity and pleasure, and not much more than that. What you get with a subcultural approach is what you kind of would expect from a traditional view, and it's a group marked by an emphasis on distinct, structured homology of culture with ideologies, material objects, and rituals that are shared through substantive interaction with a common identity and kind of a shared meaning across borders, rather than something that's just a buffet of raw materials to be harvested for ephemeral, multi-affiliated post-subculturalist view. I think the post-subculturalist view fails to explain Goth identity because we have with Goth a distinctiveness across borders. We have a clear subjective sense of group identity and like-mindedness. We have a commitment to culture and shared values and norms that are fostered through substantive, discursive, subcultural capital. And with the post-subculturalist view that can say you don't need X, Y, or Z to be Goth, you can mix and match, I don't think that sufficiently explains what Goth culture is. So, homology hypothesis. I think this is a good first step in understanding authentic Goth identity. And I'll point out that in this video, I'm talking about identity. I'm not talking about culture. While post-subculturalist and subcultural views that I just covered are an element of culture, I explained that more in a previous video, and it doesn't necessitate the homology hypothesis, I think, although I do think the post-subculturalist view is not compatible with that. But my homology hypothesis is essentially the idea that an intersection of elements, core structures, core elements of Goth create a structural resonance, and all of these things together engender a Goth identity. Now, the reason I think to have a Goth identity, there has to be this kind of coming together of core elements is because you will have people that are not Goths that enjoy post-punk. You have other subcultures and large cultures that venerate morbidity that are not Goth. You have other youth subcultures that, if you look at them, can appear ostensibly Goth or to be using a Goth aesthetic that are not Goth. So if you pull out any one of those elements and take kind of a reductionist approach to say all you need is to dress Goth to be Goth, or all you need is to listen to music to be Goth, it misses the point. It misses the kind of substantive communal identity and ideology that makes up Goth culture. And it doesn't fit with Goth culture because any one of those elements can be core tenets of a different culture. So if you have a reductionist approach, or you have a stochastic approach where kind of anything can be Goth, or you have a post-subculturalist approach, these, I think, fail to have any kind of explanatory power. I'm not going to go into too much more detail than that. I would like to in this paper I'm going to write, just to kind of lay everything out. But I think this is more of a general view to kind of tell you where I'm coming from. Hopefully that all made sense. If it doesn't make sense, please ask questions in the comments. So let's see here. So yeah, and I want to be clear that the homology hypothesis is not, again, from a reductionist view, it's not just a checklist. It's not just you have to hit these 4 or 5 things to be Goth. It's not something like that. Identity, construction, and culture are both incredibly complex, to the point where they're almost intractable or unmanageable. So I'm laying out a more simplified version of the homology hypothesis, but it's not I want to be clear, it's not a checklist of things that you have to get a certain amount of points to be Goth. It's not that simple. I just don't want to make this a 2-hour video. So, let's see, where do I want to go from here? So, what's kind of the threshold then for what needs to be had? Because as I was saying before, the notion of whether or not music is a part of this homology, or whether or not fashion is part of this homology, or any kind of whatever you want to throw out there, that's a secondary discussion. We have to first agree that goth identity is formed through a coming together of multiple core elements, and not simply a reductionist like mono element approach, or a stochastic approach, or a post-subculturalist approach. So in regards to the kind of simplicity of a checklist approach, what I'm allowing for here, what the homology hypothesis allows for, which I kind of alluded to with the music element only needing at base level to have an appreciation or understanding of, not necessarily someone who is, you would think of as an uber goth who knows every single band and has seen them all in concert, that kind of thing. You have a element of fluidity, both from a top down perspective, kind of with the tenets that make up the definitions of subculture. Each of those has a fluid, it's a spectrum, and the hard caps at the end of that spectrum can evolve. They can be fluid, because as culture moves, what is considered acceptable for what is goth music can evolve. So it's very fluid, without being post-subculturalist or postmodernist, meaning anything is anything. You can make it whatever you want. It's still structured but fluid at the same time. And from a bottom-up perspective, personal identity and relevance is also fluid. So you have the ability to put energy into whichever pillar or whichever specific element is of most interest to you. So you can have simply an understanding or appreciation that music is what formed goth culture to start with, and then you can put your passion into crafting a identity, an aesthetic, kind of a philosophical aesthetic, or a performative, sartorial image, an image that is based in kind of semiotics or an expression of yourself. Or if you're not into fashion, you can focus on art, or you can focus on whatever these pillars are. And if you want to know what my opinion are for what the pillars of the homology should be, check out the what is subculture, what is goth, why does it matter video I did, because I lay out my 4 pillars. And I think the second part to this, what kind of keeps the structure element of the homology hypothesis from being overtaken by the fluidity that's allowed, is subcultural capital. And so how this comes into play is, while you can fulfill the bare minimum, if you build your involvement, understanding, or dedication or participation in any one of these particular elements, you accrue subcultural capital, and that essentially allows you to cash in your capital for respect, for recognition, and for kind of respect and recognition. I've explained this in further detail in other videos, so I won't go into it too much. But this kind of reinforces or gives incentive for people to continue their participation. So even if they only fulfill a bare minimum for one element, and the subcultural capital aspect of culture drives them to be more passionate and more creative in another area, if they then go back to the music, for example, and increase their knowledge and participation in that arena, that would then compound their subcultural capital and increase both the respect and the incentive to continue to participate in goth culture and in this kind of communal, discursive, I keep saying discursive, dialectical formation of a cultural identity that is internalized as a personal identity and performed through these various pillars of the homology. So to close, then, one of the questions or contentions I got was, what is the threshold for this? And I think that in my version of the homology hypothesis, all of these pillars must be present for the formation of a goth identity. I don't want to say authentic goth identity because that implies some sort of objective justification, and I'm trying to avoid that because identity construction is very personal, even though it is both individual and group oriented. Actually, check out the individuality versus conformity episode of Cemetery Confessions if that sounds interesting to you. We really kind of dove into dissecting where in our personalities and identities we start and stop, and community influence and cultural norms and expectations and ideologies kind of interpolate to who we are as a person. So if that sounds interesting, check that episode out. It was a really good one, I think. So I feel that if one is missing, and this goes back to the beginning of the video, that such as music, for example, if that's not there, if you are actively rejecting music as having any sort of relevance or important historically or currently to goth, and have no interest in trying to check out new bands or taking suggestions from other people for music to try, if that is missing, then the structural resonance required for the homology hypothesis to work is not fully achieved. And so I think the way that, like I've tried to go through and explain, the way that we soften that sort of sometimes hard to swallow idea is the wide, fluid nature of the boundaries of each core element and of the individual identity, because what it allows for is the individual to find individual meaning and tribal communal meaning, something that you don't get with a post-subculturalist view, because there is nothing below the kind of playful and ever changing, ephemeral, transitive identity. It's very vapid or vacuous, and I don't feel that is indicative of goth culture. I think there is substantive, philosophical, ontological meaning to a goth identity. But I think the fluidity that's built into this system allows for and makes sense of this one missing pillar being the threshold, as it were, rather than two or three. And I think this allows for you to retain personal and structural resonance in a community that shares a common ideology, a common culture, and common meaning. So those are my thoughts. Hopefully that all made sense. I copy-pasted a couple things that I'd written before. But as I said, I've had a few drinks. So I'd be interested to talk further about this. Like I said, I want to actually write all this down in a way that is detailed and makes sense and kind of flows. But I right now I'm just kind of testing the waters to see how people feel about this. Do they feel that goth identity is this coming together, or are they going a different direction? So those are my thoughts on goth music. Thank you for watching. Check out the Cemetery Confessions podcast if you have not. You can listen to some of the recent episodes right here on the channel, or you can go to thebelfry.rip. You can get the Cemetery Confessions podcast there and take a look at all the other goth and darkly inclined podcasts that are on that network. So thanks for hanging out, and until next time, stay dark.